The economy of the People's Socialist Republic of Albania, modeled completely on the basis of Stalin's economic policies in Soviet Russia, resulted in nothing but complete and utter failure in almost every single regard. Throughout its long existence, the Communist Republic relied entirely and exclusively on foreign aid, and when it didn't, things turned south. Following the liberation of Albania in late 1944, Enver Hoxha, the first secretary of the Communist Party, would take power as prime minister. The People's Republic of Albania would then be declared in 1946. Between 1945 to 46, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration donated 26,300,000 USD to the country, supplying enough grain to feed 33% of the population. Until 1948, Albania relied on Tito's Yugoslavia, but in September of that year, it took a sharp turn and became completely reliant on Soviet technology imports. Even UN Relief itself warned that its massive grain shipments were never intended as a permanent crutch for Albania, but as a short term emergency measure. But by early 1946, Albania was still importing over 80% of its grain needs. Foreign Service reports cautioned that UN relief grants should be restricted mainly to essentials and not used to substitute for domestic output, a warning Albania again ignored. The very foundation of Albania's economy began as Soviet Russia's had, with rapid collectivization and industrial transformation intended to mirror the USSR's first 5 year plan. Unfortunately, Albania lacked even the minimal infrastructure or technical expertise necessary to implement the plan due to the country being an extremely underdeveloped one at the time that communism rose to power. Enver Hoxha's administration forced collectivization in the countryside, but with little regard for regional variations or climate conditions, which led to repeated failures in harvests. The first 5 year plan of Albania, from 1951 to 55, had high hopes for increasing industrial production within the country. However, an inefficient agricultural sector facing much of the same problems Russia had during its collectivization period ultimately killed the project's viability, as a lag in agriculture heavily weighed down on industrial development, as the two sectors are, of course, interdependent. On top of this, industrial productivity fell behind the nation's needs because the peasantry wasn't trained sufficiently in factory equipment operations. National production was extremely unsatisfactory, and by 1953, 70% of Albanians still worked in field labor. By 1960, private smallholdings still produced nearly 90% of Albania's agricultural output. State and collective farms, despite having mechanization and central services, underperformed by 20 to 30% per hectare compared to smallholders, and chronic local food shortages persisted well beyond the early years of collectivization. Albania's state planning apparatus consistently failed to meet its own targets. According to internal Albanian records from the mid 1950s, more than 40% of planned industrial projects were either unfinished or entirely stalled due to delays in receiving Soviet machinery or technical blueprints. In the agricultural sector, peasants were pushed into state enterprises under coercive pressure, and by 1954, nearly 80% of those enterprises were reporting losses rather than net productivity gains. Internal planning documents reveal that by mid 1955, over 40% of industrial enterprises were behind schedule or halted outright due to delayed equipment and poor site selection. A 1956 admission conceded that, quote, only half of the 5 year targets were achievable with existing resources. In 1959, China and the USSR, competing for influence within the country, gave Albania 13,800,000 USD and 83,800,000 USD in aid, respectively, as other Eastern Bloc nations also collectively assorted 35 million USD to aid Albania in that year of 1959 alone. Between 1955 to 1960, foreign assistance augmented Albania's budget by 223%. This international scramble to gain power over Albania's economy translated into a temporary boom in externally financed projects. Soviet led urbanization campaigns attempted to build industrial complexes in cities like Elbasan and Fier, yet these same constructions were plagued by low quality workmanship and very poor planning. Chinese engineers introduced factories that mimicked those in Maoist China but were snagged in their use of outdated technologies. Many factories never even reached full capacity. But the apparent industrial achievements in which Albania did succeed masked nothing but inefficiency behind the scenes. The Elbasan Steel Combine, for example, operational by 1966, ran at only 60% of its nameplate capacity through the early 1970s, and later inherited pollution liabilities so severe that its successor plant faced shutdowns. By 1960, the proportion of output from farms, despite the immense aid poured into the country the previous year, hadn't changed at all since 1951, and foreign assistance was still augmenting Albania's budget by 130%. Worker productivity and motivation, as in the USSR under Stalin, was extremely low. 48% of Albanian needs in wheat were met through Soviet aid imports during this period. When Soviet aid to Albania ceased, all major construction projects were delayed, and the country witnessed a sharp decline in international trade. Labor productivity declined to 12.5% between 1960 to 1963 due to a spare parts shortage. To make up for the end of Soviet aid in the country, China came to the rescue, supplying Albania with 90% food and spare mechanical parts necessary for production. Albania's dependency on external actors became so extreme that over 60% of its heavy machinery in 1963 came from Chinese exports. The result was a fragile industrial base that was entirely incapable of sustaining itself. Albania lacked trained engineers and had no means of producing complex parts locally, as countless industries fell into the same old cycles of breakdown and inactivity. Agricultural output grew only 22% over the entirety of 1961 to 1965, as opposed to what was planned in the third 5 year plan, which was intended to be a growth of around 72% during that period. 4 to 5% annual growth in agriculture might sound respectable in absolute terms, as this was above the world average, but for an agrarian country with a soaring population, meager mechanization, and government plans targeting rapid development, this growth did absolutely nothing to alleviate chronic food shortages or meet the regime's own goals that it set for itself. Overall, industrial production failed to improve over the course of the 15 years between 1950 and 1965. To add on to this gloomy prospect, the government regularly falsified statistics to exaggerate its achievements. Reports from the Albanian Workers' Party in 1966 claimed a 45% rise in industrial productivity since 1961, but internal audits revealed net increases of less than 10%. The concealment of these inefficiencies discouraged any reforms which could have been made during that period. Enver Hoxha's obsessive construction of over 750,000 concrete bunkers, which lasted from 1967 until his death, consumed 2% of Albania's net material product annually at its peak, diverting critical steel, cement, and labor from housing, roads, and factories. Each bunker cost roughly the equivalent of a two-room apartment to construct. Although finally the fourth 5 year plan would yield some economic improvements due to a long overdue series of reforms that prioritized decentralization, deregulation, and finance reform, in 1978 the People's Republic of China would finally withdraw its aid from Albania. In 1979, following the Sino-Albanian split, Enver Hoxha would publish a book berating a now deceased Mao Zedong. After the split, consumer goods production failed to meet standards for quality, and production did not meet the expectations of the most recent 5 year plan. Perhaps we can give Albania the benefit of the doubt and admit that since China withdrew aid during this period, that the nation shouldn't be blamed for its failure this time. However, that is precisely the problem with Albania's economy during the communist period. It couldn't survive on its own with the model it was implementing. By 1978, nearly all high capacity power generation infrastructure in Albania was operating with spare parts imported from either China or the USSR, many of which were no longer manufactured. Frequent blackouts now occurred, and metallurgy collapsed alongside other sectors. Albanian factories increasingly relied on salvaged or improvised components to remain operational. Albania immediately pursued a policy of superficial autarky, or national self reliance, while beginning trade relations with the West after it had stopped receiving aid from both China and the USSR. And with that being said, labor productivity declined 1.7% on average between 1980 and 1988, as the economy was failing to create new jobs. Cultivatable land declined 20% as the population boomed. On the topic of so called autarky, Albania wasn't in fact self reliant, as it imported in a single year alone in 1982 74 million USD worth of goods from Yugoslavia, 42 million USD worth of goods from Italy, 23 million worth of goods from Bulgaria, 19 million from Romania, 17 million from West Germany, 16 million from France, 15 million from Poland, 13 million from Greece, 12 million from Hungary, 4 million from China, and 3 million USD worth of goods from the United States. By the mid 1980s, Its Western trade alone reached some 200 million USD annually, draining Albania's central bank reserves so severely that by 1990, GDP per capita stagnated at roughly $450. To be clear, that would be poorer than Lesotho in southern Africa. Albania's self reliance had no substance other than its ideological posturing. The trade imbalance, which had resulted from this period, was severe and harsh. Imports far outpaced exports, particularly in the domain of capital goods, medical supplies, and food staples. So much for self reliance. As a result, food rationing became increasingly severe throughout the 1980s, with reports of urban centers receiving less than 1,500 calories per person per day in state provisions, meaning that the Albanian population was overall definitively food deprived and undernourished. Enver Hoxha, inspired by Joseph Stalin and still the leader of the Albanian Communist Party 40 years down the road, perpetually invoked a state of emergency by fabricating conspiracies and purges that reached their peak between late 1981 to 1983. Thousands of officials and their families were arrested without formal charges or due process. Arrest decrees were issued unilaterally, bypassing all checks and balances, while trials were transformed into public spectacles of denunciation where Hoxha himself would mock purged politicians in person. Governance had dissolved into his own personal court. Today's executioner could be on the chopping block tomorrow. Mehmet Shehu, the 23rd Prime Minister of Albania, supposedly killed himself following his purge from the government. The Shehu family was placed under house arrest, only allowed to attend Shehu's funeral, but even his wife and brothers, however, were too afraid to attend. Kadri Hasbiu, the Minister of Internal Affairs, was also arrested and executed. In his final days, Enver Hoxha was confined to a wheelchair as he suffered from diabetes and cerebral ischemia. On April 11th of 1985, he would thankfully pass away at the age of 76. Over the entire course of Albania's existence, its ability to improve its economy was completely dependent on its ability to receive foreign aid. It was always a brutal failure, and the way it would finally end proved this fact. In the summer of 1991, the year before communism in Albania finally collapsed, Albania's exports were half of what they were the previous year. Industrial and farm output was failing to increase as well. Matter of fact, it wasn't increasing at all. The GDP per person had dropped to the levels of underdeveloped Southeast Asian economies such as Indonesia or Sri Lanka. The budget deficit was 20% of the country's GDP, and unemployment was at about 35%. The economic freefall in the early 1990s finally showed the world the hollow foundations of Albania's centrally planned economy. Factories that had once employed thousands of workers shut down in succession due to lack of raw materials and buyers. Agricultural cooperatives dissolved, leaving many peasants without access to land or equipment. The resulting chaos saw the rise of black markets and mass emigration. Net material product growth did not exceed 1% annually and grew 0% between 1985 to 1990. Agriculture and other industries failed as consumer goods entered a mass shortage. During this period, average monthly wages in Albania lost 65% of their purchasing power due to inflation. Essential commodities like soap, flour, and medicine virtually disappeared from store shelves. The black market economy thrived, controlled by a growing class of intermediaries and opportunists, many of whom were tied to remnants of the state security apparatus. Albania's ambitious experiment in Stalinist replication was doomed from the start. From the earliest days of post war reconstruction through the successive 5 year plans, every sector remained chronically underperforming, propped up only by ever larger infusions of foreign aid. When Soviet and then Chinese assistance finally did dry up, the facade of progress collapsed overnight, revealing Albania as a nation lacking both the technical capacity and the managerial expertise to function independently. Meanwhile, relentlessly stubborn government policy discouraged skilled labor and redirected precious resources into grandiose and unproductive endeavors like bunker building. By the time communism unraveled in the early 90s, Albania stood as yet another example of a failed centrally planned economy, divorced from local conditions and dependent on external patronage, with its population impoverished, its industries shuttered, and its promise of socialist self reliance entirely discredited.